What if I told you some spirits never left their graves, and tonight they might be watching you? If you love ghost stories, hit subscribe, tap like, and share this video so we can bring you even more terrifying tales. Subscribe, like, share to keep the ghosts.
Do you know that in a quiet coastal town in northern Australia, there's a glass cabinet that no one dares to open? Inside it sits a porcelain doll, red velvet dress, sapphire eyes, lips painted the color of fresh blood. Her name is Scarlett, and according to every witness who's ever stood before her, the doll doesn't just hold a spirit, she is one. Asterisk. The story begins in 1921 in the seaside town of Bowen, Queensland. Back then, Bowen was a place of fishermen, salt merchants, and small wooden cottages lined along the cliffs that overlook the Coral Sea. A sailor named Thomas Harrow had just returned home after a year at sea. His wife, Margaret, and their 6-year-old daughter, Lydia, waited eagerly by the harbor, waving their arms as his ship docked at sunrise. Thomas brought home gifts: seashells from the Solomon Islands, a pearl necklace, and one peculiar treasure he said he'd found in the wreckage of a ship that had burned off the coast of Papua New Guinea. Wrapped in a damp cloth was a porcelain doll, immaculate despite the charred remains of the ship around her. Her hair was the color of autumn leaves, her eyes shockingly blue, and stitched along the inner seam of her silk gown was a single word in crimson thread: Scarlett. She survived the fire, Thomas said with a half smile. Maybe she brings luck. He was wrong. Asterisk. Lydia adored the doll instantly. She carried Scarlett everywhere, to the garden, to the seaside cliffs, even to bed. Her mother often said the girl had finally found a best friend. But within days, something changed. At night, Margaret would find the doll propped up in different positions, standing by the window, sitting on the kitchen table, once even at the foot of her bed, though Lydia swore she hadn't moved her. Soon, Lydia began talking to Scarlett, as if she were alive. She told me about the ocean, Lydia said one morning. She said she used to live there, and she misses the waves. Margaret laughed, until Lydia added something else. She also said she drowned. Asterisk. The Harrows' home sat close enough to the sea that the sound of waves filled the night air. But one night, just past midnight, Margaret woke to a sound that didn't belong to the ocean. It was crying. Faint, childlike sobbing echoed from Lydia's room. She opened the door. The air inside was freezing. Lydia slept soundly, but Scarlett sat upright beside her pillow. Margaret leaned closer. The sound was coming from the doll. The next morning, Thomas dismissed it as exhaustion, but Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something had entered their home, something that wasn't leaving. Asterisk. Weeks passed, and Lydia's health began to fail. She complained of headaches, nightmares, and a shadowy figure with Scarlett's voice that whispered her name at night. Then came the scratches, faint at first, lines on her arms, red and uneven, but soon they formed letters: SCAR. Margaret screamed when she saw them. Thomas demanded to throw the doll away, but when he went to fetch it, Scarlett was gone. They found her in the attic, standing in the middle of the floor, surrounded by a circle of salt that no one in the family had poured. Asterisk. Doctors called it fever, neighbors called it possession. For 3 nights, Lydia whispered in her sleep, she wants to go home. On the 4th, her heart stopped when they laid her body out for burial. The doll was placed on a nearby shelf, silent, still, but when Thomas entered the room one last time to kiss his daughter's forehead, Scarlett's eyes had turned gray. He swore the doll was breathing. Asterisk. Margaret couldn't bear to destroy it. Instead, she sealed Scarlett in a wooden box and locked her in the attic, beneath the beams that groaned with sea wind and time. That night, the house came alive. Soft knocks echoed from the ceiling. The floorboards creaked as if tiny feet moved above them. And faintly, from somewhere in the darkness, "Mummy, why did you lock me away?" Asterisk. Weeks later, Thomas returned from sea to find the house empty, the door wide open, and on the kitchen table a trail of wet footprints, leading from the hallway to the attic stairs. Margaret was never found. In the attic, the box was open. Scarlett sat alone, her porcelain hands stained with something dark. The wind outside sounded almost like laughter. Asterisk. They say the Harrow home stood empty for years afterward. Locals claimed they saw a little girl in white by the window at night, crying into the sea breeze. And every storm season, when the wind howled through the cracks of old Bowen houses, you could hear a second sound beneath it, the faint sobbing of a doll. But this was only the beginning, because the doll didn't stay buried, and the next person who touched her would discover that Scarlett wasn't just haunted, she was hungry. Do you know what happens when grief refuses to die? When sorrow festers in the walls of a home until even silence begins to whisper. That's what happened in the Harrow house. After Lydia was gone, after the funeral, Thomas Harrow left again for sea. He couldn't bear the sight of the empty bedroom, the toys untouched, the small bed that would never be filled again. So the house belonged only to Margaret and the doll. She told neighbors he'd locked Scarlett in the attic, sealed with salt and prayers. But within days, she heard movement above her head, footsteps, slow, deliberate, then a child's laughter. At first she tried to explain it. Rats, wind, old wood, shifting, but deep down, Margaret knew her daughter's laughter better than anyone. And this wasn't Lydia's. It was different, hollow, echoing, like it came from inside the walls themselves. Margaret began keeping a journal. The pages later found by police described nights of terror. June 3rd, she's moving again. I hear the floor creak over my bed. June 6th, someone whispered my name. It wasn't Lydia. It wasn't human. June 10th, the crying stopped. Now she hums. At exactly midnight each night, a lullaby floated down from the attic, the same one Lydia used to sing to Scarlett. Margaret couldn't sleep. The house smelled faintly of salt water, as though the sea itself had seeped into the walls. On the 7th night, the humming grew louder, closer. It sounded as though it were coming from the attic door itself. When Margaret reached the stairs, the air turned cold enough to frost her breath. The door handle was icy. She opened it, just a crack, and candlelight flickered against something moving in the dark. Scarlett sat in the center of the floor. Around her, seashells arranged in a perfect circle. Each shell was wet. The air smelled of tide and smoke. Margaret whispered her daughter's name, and the doll's head tilted slowly toward her. The candle went out. The next day, Margaret begged the local parish for help. Father Keegan, an aging Irish priest, visited the home. He was skeptical, but when he stepped into the attic, the temperature dropped sharply. He began reading a blessing, his voice trembling slightly. Halfway through the prayer, a child's voice interrupted him. "Don't take her away." The priest froze. The voice came from the doll, lips unmoving, eyes blank, sound echoing through the room like it had nowhere else to go. Father Keegan left immediately. He later told the parish he'd seen a sadness so old, it had learned how to speak. That night, a storm rolled in from the sea. Rain lashed against the windows. Thunder cracked over the cliffs. Margaret sat by the fireplace, clutching her daughter's locket. Above her, something was pacing again, faster this time. Then she heard splashing. Water dripped through the ceiling. Though the roof was intact, it wasn't rainwater, it was salt water. She climbed the attic steps, trembling. Every step she took, the sound of dripping grew louder. When she opened the attic door, waves of seawater surged across the floorboards, and sitting in the middle, untouched by the rising water, was Scarlett. Her eyes glowed faintly blue. "Come play, Mummy," the voice said. Margaret screamed. The next morning, the storm cleared, but Margaret Harrow was gone. Her journal's last entry was dated the night before. "I saw her face tonight, not Lydia's, but something older. The sea wants her back, and I think I'm next." When police entered the house, they found the attic empty, except for a damp shawl and a doll sitting on the windowsill, staring out toward the ocean. And though her porcelain face was as still as ever, tears streaked her cheeks. Word spread quickly. The Harrow house became a local legend. Fishermen swore they saw a woman's figure standing by the attic window, her hair drifting as though underwater. Children dared each other to approach the door, only to run screaming when they heard whispers from inside. Eventually, the property was sold, the furniture removed, and the doll, taken by a distant cousin, packed away in a crate marked personal effects. But no one could say where the crate ended up, only that, soon after, strange occurrences began at the docks, tools moving on their own, ships delayed by inexplicable fog, and one sailor found drowned, with tiny porcelain fingerprints around his throat. Every town has its ghosts, but in Bowen, they say one ghost has a body, porcelain, perfect, and waiting. Scarlett was gone, yes, but she hadn't left, and the next time she appeared, she would have a new owner. Years passed, the Harrow house decayed, its walls swollen with damp, its roof sagging like a wound that refused to heal. But the story of Scarlett didn't die there, because one man made sure she would be found again. Asterisk in 1939, Edward Alcott, a traveling antiques dealer, arrived in Bohan. He was the sort of man who treated history like currency, buying what others feared, and selling it to those who didn't know any better. When he heard whispers of the drowned doll, his curiosity overpowered his caution. Locals tried to warn him. They told him about Margaret Harrow. The voices, the salt water that dripped from the ceiling. Alcott laughed. Ghosts, he said, make good stories, not bad prophets. He found the Harrow property in ruin, ivy choking the walls, the sea visible through broken windows. In the attic, under a layer of dust and sea salt, he found her Scarlett. Her dress was stained, her face cracked, but her eyes were still a perfect glassy blue. When he picked her up, the air shifted, a sudden chill. Something exhaled. He thought it was wind. He was wrong. Asterisk Alcott returned to Sydney with Scarlett packed carefully in a crate. He displayed her in his shop window, labeling her Victorian Maritime Doll, extremely rare. For a week, nothing happened. Then customers began reporting strange feelings, dizziness, nausea, the smell of salt water that appeared out of nowhere. One woman fainted in front of the window. When she awoke, she claimed she'd seen a child's face pressed against the glass from inside the doll's eyes. Alcott dismissed it all as hysteria, until the night he heard the laughter. Asterisk. His journal, later recovered from police archives, described it vividly. Heard a tapping tonight, thought it was rats. Found Scarlett turned toward the window, though I'd left her facing the wall. Later, soft humming, the same tune again and again, a lullaby. When Alcott finally looked closer, he noticed moisture collecting around the doll's case. It wasn't condensation, it was salt crystals. By morning, every surface in his shop carried a thin layer of sea salt, and the faint sound of waves echoed whenever he stood near her. Asterisk. To prove the story's false, Alcott set up a camera, primitive, slow, using long exposure. He positioned it directly in front of Scarlett and left it overnight. When he developed a film, his hands trembled so badly that the negatives tore. The photograph showed the doll, yes, but also a woman standing behind her, drenched, eyes hollow, hands resting on the doll's shoulders. There was no one else in the room. That night, Alcott didn't sleep. He locked the shop, nailed boards across the door, and took the doll to his apartment. He thought he'd escaped the curse. He'd only brought it home. Asterisk. Neighbors began complaining. They heard a child singing through the walls. Sometimes a sound of water splashing, as though someone was bathing a child in the middle of the night. When Alcott's maid entered his study one morning, she found him staring at the doll, whispering softly. She remembers the sea. She wants to go back. His eyes were unfocused, his lips pale. By the next week, he'd stopped eating. Then one morning, the maid found his apartment flooded ankle deep in seawater. No pipes were broken, the walls were dry, and in the center of the room, sitting upright on the table, was Scarlett. Alcott's body was found later, face down, salt crusted over his mouth and eyes. Asterisk. Scarlett vanished again after Alcott's death. For years, the doll's location remained unknown, but in 1974, a private collector named Vivian Clark claimed to have acquired a haunted maritime doll from an estate sale. Her home, a sprawling Victorian manor in Melbourne, soon became infamous. Guests reported strange sounds from the display room, footsteps, dripping water, faint crying. Vivian didn't mind. She was fascinated by death, by the idea that objects could absorb sorrow. She believed Scarlett was alive. She would sit for hours in front of the glass case, talking to the doll as if to a child, and sometimes, the doll answered. Witnesses said the glass would fog slightly, as if from tiny breaths within. Asterisk. In her personal diary, Vivian wrote, "She comes to me in dreams. The sea is endless. A little girl stands on the shore, her hands holding the doll. Behind her, something vast, something ancient, rising from the water." A month later, Vivian drowned in her own bathtub. The water was full of sand. The doll was recovered from her display case, perfectly dry. Asterisk. Today, Scarlett resides in the Queensland Museum's restricted collection, sealed in a climate-controlled glass box. Staff are forbidden to move her without supervision. Yet even now, night guards report the faint sound of dripping water echoing through the halls. Some claim that when the security lights flicker, they can see a second shadow inside the display, that of a woman, standing just behind the glass. And sometimes, they say, the doll smiles. Asterisk. Maybe Scarlett was never just a doll. Maybe she was a door, a vessel carrying the grief of generations. The voice of the sea that took them all. They say curses fade with time, but sometimes, time itself becomes part of the curse. Do you know what happens when something refuses to be forgotten? It returns again and again, wearing different faces, whispering the same name. Scarlett. Asterisk. In 1982, the Queensland Museum of Maritime History hosted a new exhibition titled Echoes of the Sea. Among ancient shipwreck relics, one object drew quiet fascination. A Victorian doll inside a sealed glass case, catalogued only as artifact number 0724A. Behind the curtain, curators whispered the truth. It was Scarlett. Officially, the museum denied it, but privately, staff were warned not to photograph her. No flash, no touch, no movement. Security guard Daniel Hurst was the first to notice something wrong. Every morning, the case was misted from the inside, as though something had breathed on the glass overnight. And the smell, not dust, not old fabric, but brine, ocean salt and rot. Daniel's report from July 3, 1983, later archived by the museum, reads, heard dripping again. Walked past Exhibit 2 for a puddle forming beneath display. Couldn't locate source. Doll appears slightly turned toward the corridor. Will review footage tomorrow, but the cameras caught nothing. Every time the tape rolled, static appeared over the exact frame showing Scarlett's case. Visitors began whispering, claiming that if you stood before the glass long enough, you'd see waves moving inside her eyes. One evening, a maintenance worker named Clara Monroe stayed late to polish the brass plaques. The museum was empty, except for her and the sound of distant thunder. She passed Scarlett's display and froze. Through the reflection of the glass, she saw a figure standing behind her, a woman, soaked, dressed in white, her mouth open, seaweed tangled in her hair. Clara turned, but no one was there. She ran to the exit, but the doors refused to open. All she could hear was the sound of waves crashing inside the walls. By morning, she was found outside the museum gates, soaked to the skin, trembling, whispering the same word she remembers. In 1984, a team of local investigators, the Paranormal Research Society of Brisbane, gained permission to spend one night in the museum. They brought electromagnetic sensors, cameras, audio recorders. The footage they captured remains one of Australia's most debated paranormal documents. At 2:17 a.m., the recording shows Scarlett's case rattling violently, though no vibration was detected elsewhere in the building. At 2:19 a.m., a faint female voice can be heard, "Don't let her drown again." Seconds later, every piece of equipment shut down simultaneously. The temperature dropped to 6 degrees Celsius. One investigator, Ben Lowell, later described what he saw in that moment. The doll's eyes filled with water. I swear it. Tiny drops formed and rolled down her face like tears. After the incident, the museum sealed Scarlett in the sublevel archive, away from public display. For 2 decades, she remained unseen, locked in darkness among forgotten artifacts. Yet even there, her presence persisted. Archivists complained of hearing footsteps in the basement, and sometimes, when they turned the corner, they'd catch a flash of red velvet vanishing around the bend. In 2001, a burst water pipe flooded the when staff arrived. Every box and crate was soaked, except one. Scarlett's case was bone dry. In 2007, a medium named Eloise Trent, specializing in psychometry, the ability to read an object's history by touch, was invited to examine Scarlett. The experiment was filmed. As she placed her hands on the glass, her breathing quickened. There's a mother, a child, the mother is screaming. The child is gone. She blames the doll. She cursed it. She bound the spirit to it. Moments later, Eloise collapsed, convulsing violently. When she regained consciousness, she whispered, "She's looking for her mother." She refused to ever return to the museum. A few months later, strange phenomena spread beyond the museum. Electrical surges, sudden floods, nearby houses reporting taps running on their own, mirrors fogging without reason. One night, an intern tasked with checking humidity sensors entered the archive. He took a photo on his phone for records. The image later showed a pair of wet footprints, leading away from Scarlett's case and stopping in front of the exit door. No one had been down there with him. The museum decided to quietly remove the doll. A private donor whose name was redacted offered to secure and preserve Scarlett in a more controlled environment. The crate left the museum. On March 8, 2008, 3 days later, the driver of the transport van was found unconscious on a rural road near Brisbane. The van had flooded from the inside. Inside the crate, Scarlett sat dry. The museum never spoke of her again, but according to internal memos, the doll was delivered to a private residence, one belonging to a woman named Eleanor Vance. And so, the sea remembered. The water found her, found the one who would listen, who would keep her safe, or perhaps, who would keep her alive. Next time, we meet the last keeper, the woman who became part of the curse. Do you know what it means to look into a mirror and see something looking back that isn't you? For most, it's superstition. For Eleanor Vance, it became her last connection to the living world. In 2008, Eleanor Vance was 32 years old, an artist, part-time teacher, and researcher in Australian folklore. She specialized in spirit photography, the early 20th century belief that cameras could capture ghosts. When she received Scarlett through a private donation, Eleanor was thrilled. To her, it wasn't a curse, it was history reborn. She placed the doll in her studio, surrounded by old mirrors and film cameras. The room smelled faintly of salt, but she thought little of it. Her first journal entry, dated April 5, 2008, reads, "She's beautiful. You can see sadness in her face. It's like she's waiting for someone." By the second week, her tone changed. I hear dripping at night. Thought it was a leak, but it's only around her display. Sometimes I think I hear humming. Asterisk, it started with reflections. Eleanor noticed that when she filmed Scarlett, the doll's eyes moved slightly, but only in playback. She tried to debunk it. Camera tricks, lighting impaired, until one night she left the camera running for 8 hours. At 3:14 a.m., the footage showed a faint shape forming in the mirror behind the doll, a woman's silhouette, shifting, swaying as though underwater. When Eleanor paused the video, the power in her apartment went out. A mirror across the room cracked from top to bottom. Asterisk, panicked but fascinated, Eleanor contacted a medium named Dr. Helena Ward, a former anthropologist turned psychic consultant. Helena had investigated hauntings across Australia, but when she arrived, something about Scarlett unsettled even her. She refused to touch the doll. It's not a spirit trapped inside, she said. It's a fragment of something vast, the sea itself alive through memory. Eleanor convinced her to perform a mirror ritual, an old Celtic cleansing adapted from maritime folklore. Helena hesitated but agreed, recording every step. Asterisk, the ritual required a triad of reflections. 3 mirrors forming a triangle around the cursed object, trapping the spirit between their surfaces. Helena's notes detail the process. Midnight, Dalit Center. 3 mirrors uncovered, salt line complete. Begin invocation. For 15 minutes, nothing happened. Then the candles flickered violently. A low hum filled the air, like the sound of a ship's hull vibrating underwater. Helena began to speak in tongues, her voice echoing strangely, as if underwater. Eleanor's video shows droplets forming on the mirrors, sliding upward instead of down. At 12:19 a.m., the power cut out. A scream not human, not entirely filled the room. When the lights returned, one mirror had shattered. Helena was unconscious. Scarlett sat perfectly still, but her eyes now glowed faintly red, as though reflecting fire. Asterisk, Eleanor took Helena to the hospital. The diagnosis? Acute hypothermia. Despite warm weather, she survived, but she never spoke again. When Eleanor returned home, she found the remaining mirrors fogged, and the sound of ocean waves echoing softly inside her studio. Her cat refused to enter the room. She continued to film, desperate to understand the connection between Scarlett, the mirrors, and the sea. The final entry in her research log. She isn't angry, she's lonely. The curse is just memory. It wants to return home. I think if I show her the sea again, she'll rest. Asterisk, 2 weeks later, Eleanor drove to the coast, to the cliffs near Bowen, the very place where Scarlett was first found in 1921. She carried the doll wrapped in linen, a small mirror tied to the front. Locals saw her that evening, walking along the rocks under a blood-red sunset, humming softly. When a storm rolled in, she was still there, standing on the edge, holding the doll toward the sea. Witnesses later claimed they saw a column of mist rise from the water, taking the shape of a woman reaching upward. Then lightning struck. When rescue teams arrived, Eleanor's car was still parked nearby. Inside, they found her journal dry, but the pages were stained with salt. Scarlett was gone. Asterisk, days later, a fisherman found the doll tangled in his nets, miles offshore. Despite being submerged in seawater, it was completely dry. Authorities transferred Scarlett to an undisclosed private storage facility in Sydney. For years, she remained there sealed in climate control, catalogued as Artifact X241, but workers reported the same phenomena: dripping sounds, whispers, mirrors cracking in the bathrooms, and the smell of the sea. And sometimes, when walking past the storage vault at night, they heard a woman's voice calling from within, "Eleanor, come back." Asterisk, the ritual didn't banish the curse. It amplified it, binding the spirit not to the doll, but to the memory of everyone who ever touched it. Scarlett didn't just remember the sea remembered us. Do you know what it means when a curse begins to bleed? Not metaphorically, but literally. Scarlett's doll, long locked away in a museum glass case, began to weep red. Visitors claimed they saw droplets of crimson forming beneath its porcelain chin, staining the lace collar that had once been pure white. At first, museum staff dismissed it as condensation or dye from decaying fabric, but one janitor swore he wiped the glass, and when he looked up again, a streak of red was smeared from the inside, as though a tiny hand had dragged across the pane. The local press caught wind of it. "Cursed doll of Queensland weeps blood." One headline read, "Skeptics mocked it, believers prayed." Yet every night, at precisely 3:07 a.m., the security cameras flickered, and when they resumed, Scarlett's head had turned, always slightly, always to face the nearest person entering the room. That same week, Evelyn Marston, the museum's curator, collapsed while cataloging artifacts. Her hand brushed Scarlett's display case moments before she fainted. In the hospital, she woke with deep scratches across her arm, in the shape of tiny fingers. Doctors couldn't explain it. Evelyn later confessed she'd dreamt of a little girl whispering, "She's lonely, don't leave her again." The museum closed temporarily, but the doll remained untouched. Researchers began to trace Scarlett's trail back through the years, uncovering police reports, diary fragments, and local lore. The veil of normalcy surrounding her began to rip apart. They found that Scarlett Langford, the original owner, the real girl behind the legend, was not buried where her records claimed. In the family plot, her coffin contained only stones wrapped in linen. The doll, it seemed, had become her tomb. Local historian Dr. Callum Greaves theorized that Scarlett's mother, tormented by guilt and grief, performed a seance to call her daughter's spirit back. Her writings, recovered from a decaying journal, detailed the ritual. The doll will serve as vessel, blood of mother, breath of child. The soul must not wander. A curse, then not of vengeance, but of desperate love. But as the years passed, the energy twisted. Visitors began to report seeing a woman in a red veil standing by the museum window after midnight. One tourist snapped a photo, a dark silhouette, head bowed, hands folded over something small. When enhanced, it appeared the woman was holding the doll. By now, Scarlett's legend had transcended folklore. Paranormal investigators arrived from across the world. One team, the Spirit Lens Collective, filmed an overnight investigation. The footage, never released in full, showed a chilling moment at 2:59 a.m. One of the crew members whispered, "Did anyone just touch me?" The audio spiked. A faint child's giggle echoed from inside the display. Then the glass cracked. The crew fled, leaving cameras rolling. The footage ends with static and a single word faintly audible, as if whispered directly into the microphone: "Stay." When the museum reopened, the exhibit had changed. Scarlett's case was reinforced, the lights kept low, but those who dared stand near it claimed to feel a pulse in the air, rhythmic, faint, almost like a heartbeat. And sometimes, when the guide's back was turned, the doll's eyes followed. Do you believe a mother's love can become a curse? Scarlett's mother tried to preserve her daughter's spirit. Instead, she trapped it forever between life and death. Some say if you look at the doll too long, you'll dream of a girl in a crimson dress, standing in your room's corner, whispering, "Do you love me too?" Do you know what happens when a mirror starts to whisper your name back? When the Queensland Museum relocated Scarlett's doll to a private exhibit for study, the staff found a small Victorian hand mirror inside the crate. It wasn't on the inventory list. The handle was carved with the initials SL, Scarlett Langford. At first glance, the mirror was ordinary, silver-backed, worn, the kind of artifact that rarely drew attention. But under UV light, faint words appeared scratched into the glass. "She's here with me." The curator assigned to examine it, Dr. Amelia Voss, documented a strange anomaly. Her audio logs still survive. "Whenever I turn off the lights, I hear faint tapping behind me. It comes from the mirror's direction, like fingernails tracing glass. Sometimes, when I look closely, my reflection isn't quite right." On one occasion, she recorded what sounded like a child humming a lullaby from early 1900s Australia. The same tune noted in Scarlett's diary: "Sleep, my darling, sleep so sound. For angels guard you all around." When Dr. Voss replayed the footage, the humming was not on the audio track, it was inside the playback itself, faintly echoing as if carried through the speaker from another world. She sealed the mirror in a leaf-aligned box and made a note: "Subject may act as spiritual conduit, possible psychomagnetic residue." But 3 days later, her assistant found her unconscious on the lab floor. The mirror shattered beside her. The shards, arranged in a perfect circle, reflected one single image, Scarlett's doll. Yet the doll had been in another room. The legend deepened. Locals began calling the pair the Sisters of Glass. They said Scarlett's soul was split, half within the doll, half within the mirror. Two prisons, two reflections of one restless child. When paranormal researcher Ethan Cole arrived to investigate, he brought modern equipment, EMF sensors, EVP recorders, and full-spectrum cameras. What he captured would become one of the most chilling pieces of footage ever tied to the Scarlett case. At 3:07 a.m., the same cursed hour, the sensors went wild. A whisper filled the air, multiple voices, overlapping, like a chorus of children speaking in unison. "Let me see. Don't turn away. She's behind you." Cole turned the camera toward the mirror. For a split second, a second reflection appeared beside him. A pale girl in crimson. Her eyes were glassy, her mouth unmoving, yet her reflection smiled. After that night, Cole abandoned paranormal work entirely. He claimed that in every mirror he looked into afterward, bathroom, car, hotel lobby, he saw Scarlett standing in the background, her red dress fluttering in invisible wind. He destroyed all mirrors in his home, covering reflective surfaces with black cloth. When he was interviewed years later, his voice trembled. "She doesn't want to be seen anymore. She wants to be someone again." Scarlett's mirror was returned to storage, sealed and labeled "Do Not Display." But in 2019, a maintenance worker accidentally broke the seal while cleaning that same week. Reports began surfacing from the museum's night guards' cold drafts in closed halls, distant laughter, and their own reflections, blinking out of sync. One guard quit after catching sight of a small handprint on his face in the mirror. When no one had touched him, another claimed he saw the mirror fog up from the inside, and across the mist appeared 5 letters written in reverse: SOI. Experts now say the mirror may be an anchor, binding the spirit to the physical world. Removing it would risk releasing what's trapped inside, so it remains locked in a vault, never polished, never moved. but staff still whisper about a faint, rhythmic sound echoing through the basement at night, like glass, breathing. And sometimes, if you're quiet enough, you can still hear the child's lullaby from the dark. Asterisk, do you dare look into the mirror that remembers the dead? They say if you whisper Scarlett 3 times before sleep, your reflection will blink twice, and for a heartbeat, you won't see yourself anymore. Do you know what happens when a spirit no longer needs a vessel, because it finds a new host? That is what investigators believe happened in the final chapter of Scarlett's curse. When the doll, the mirror, and the spirit all aligned, it began quietly. In 2022, the Queensland Museum was preparing a new exhibition, Objects of the Afterlife. For the first time, Scarlett's doll was to be displayed alongside its mirror, the so-called Sisters of Glass. The staff joked nervously about the curse. They'd heard the stories, the whispers, the glass breaking, the bloodstains, but the public wanted spectacle, and Scarlett's legend promised record attendance. The night before the opening, technician Ryan Hale was tasked with final inspections. He worked alone after midnight, surrounded by dim emergency lights and silent exhibits. Security cameras show him stopping by Scarlett's display. He checks the locks, adjusts the lighting. Then, for reasons no one can explain, he opens the case. Inside, the doll sits perfectly still, her cracked porcelain face lit by the flicker of his flashlight. Ryan later told investigators that he felt drawn, like the air itself was pulling his hand toward her. He reached out and touched her cheek. The power cut out instantly. In the security footage, the portion that wasn't corrupted, you can see a faint, red glow spreading through the exhibit. Then, one by one, the other cameras died. For 7 minutes, the museum was silent and dark. When the lights returned, Ryan was gone. The doll was lying face down on the floor, and the mirror was missing. They found him hours later, standing outside by the sea cliffs. His eyes were open but unblinking, his clothes soaked in salt water. When paramedics tried to speak to him, he whispered just one word, Scarlett. He was hospitalized for months, diagnosed with dissociative fugue, but strange phenomena followed him everywhere, reflections moving on their own. Doll laughter recorded on his phone, crimson handprints appearing on his window. One night he vanished from his hospital room. On the pillow lay a shard of mirror, and a single line written in blood. She's free now. When authorities returned to the museum, they discovered that the mirror had reappeared inside Scarlett's display. Yet this time, the doll's reflection was missing. Experts couldn't explain it. Paranormal investigators swore that the glass showed faint movement, like a small figure pacing behind it. But there was no one inside the case. Then came the final night of recording. Footage later confiscated by Australian authorities, but leaked briefly online. In the video, a night guard named Leah Carson documents a strange sound, a child's voice humming the old lullaby. She pans her camera toward the display. The doll's head turns slowly, until it faces her directly. The humming stops in the reflection behind Leah. A little girl in crimson can be seen standing just over her shoulder. The screen distorts, the image warps, and Leah drops the camera. The video ends with static. Leah was never found. In the aftermath, the exhibit was permanently sealed. The museum director ordered both artifacts encased in concrete and moved to an undisclosed underground facility. Yet those who live near the coast claim that on certain stormy nights, a red light flickers from beneath the waves, as if something buried is still breathing. And sometimes, in the town's older houses, parents report hearing their children talking to someone unseen. When asked who, the children always answer the same way: Scarlett's playing with me. Theories abound. Some claim Scarlett never died, that she transcended, using her cursed objects as stepping stones toward rebirth. Others believe she simply became the curse itself, a wandering consciousness bound to any reflection that dares to remember her. A few paranormal historians even argue that the original ritual succeeded. The mother's wish was granted. Scarlett did come back, but what returned wasn't her. Do you believe an object can hunger? Can porcelain crave the warmth of a heartbeat, or glass long for a breath? Scarlett's ghost, they say, still searches for the next vessel, the next reflection, the next person to whisper her name. So if you ever find an antique doll dressed in red, or a mirror that hums in the dark, don't touch it, don't speak to it, and above all, don't say her name. Some legends die when forgotten, others grow stronger in silence. Scarlett's curse may be buried, but not broken, because sometimes, when we stare too long into the darkness stares back. If you want more true haunted stories from around the world, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us, would you dare keep Scarlett's doll in your house?